A mansion on a hill. Slaves. A cruel and inhumane slave master who eventually passes away. A mysterious devil dog who appears at the funeral. Ghosts and demons and flies. Lots of flies. All this should tell you all that we have a story from Appalachia. Rotherwood Mansion sits on a hill where two forks of the Holston River meet in Kingsport, Tennessee. Built by a man named Frederick Ross early in the 19th century and named from Sir Walter Scott's book Ivanhoe, this house was a showplace in that Appalachian frontier town. Ross had a daughter, Rowena, who met an untimely death, after which Frederick Ross sold his home to his slave overseer, Joshua Phipps. Now, Phipps had a reputation of being a very cruel taskmaster to the men and women over whom he had control. In fact, it's said he reveled in his cruelty, carrying a long black snake whip at all times, just so he could enforce his will as painfully as possible. In case the whip wasn't enough, he also carried two fully loaded sidearms at all times, in case a slave refused to do as he was told or dared talk back to him. He wasn't afraid to use those guns either, and was known to have shot dead anybody who did so. Under Phipps' control, Rotherwood turned into hell. Slave cells were added inside the mansion's basement, with no windows and only one locked opening. All the field hands were forced to spend their nights there, huddled against the cold and the dampness, suffering from the rain and snow that came through that locked, barred opening to the outside that contained no glass. On the third floor, Phipps built a whipping post for additional punishment options for his slaves. It said the blood stains from the whippings inflicted in that room are still on the wooden floors to this day. It's also said that the post and the slave cells were put into the house because Joshua Phipps enjoyed hearing the misery and the screaming echoing throughout that home. As he got older, he made a strange request. He asked that when he died, he be buried standing up on the top of the hill at Rotherwood so he could always be looking down into the bottoms and see the slaves at work. Well, folks, apparently he never got that request granted. You see, one day Joshua Phipps awoke in severe pain. He tried to get up to summon help, but found himself frozen in his bed. Now, this frightened him, so he tried to call out for help, but found that he couldn't move his mouth or make any sound whatsoever. He was lying there, helpless as a newborn child. Just as he was getting his head around his predicament, in through the open bedroom window came the biggest swarm of flies you could ever imagine. So many, in fact, they darkened the room, and they were coming for Joshua Phipps. They settled on his face and head, completely covering them. They even started to crawl into the inside of his nose and his mouth, causing him to be unable to catch a breath. Every time he opened his mouth, a multitude of flies entered, making things worse. Unable to move his hands to swat the flies away, and unable to move his head away or to call out for help, he lay there and suffered in absolute terror. When the master failed to appear at the breakfast table at the usual time, one of his slaves climbed the stairs to check on him. When they entered the bedroom, they found the old man cold, stiff, and dead, covered from head to toe with large black flies. This slave called for help, and pretty soon the flies were chased away, leaving only Joshua Phipps' lifeless corpse lying in the bed. They put his body into a simple homemade coffin and took it to the funeral home. Pretty soon, the story of how Phipps passed away made it around the community. Most of the folks there figured that the slaves at Rotherwood had called down a curse on the old man in return for all the years of senseless cruelty he had imposed on them. Well, since Phipps didn't belong to any church, the funeral was held at that magnificent mansion on the hill. Rather than burying him up at Rotherwood, as he'd requested, his relatives decided to place him in the local cemetery instead, so a carriage was there to take him. The funeral procession began down the driveway until suddenly the carriage stopped. No matter what the driver did, no matter how hard the horses pulled, that funeral carriage would not budge from the spot where it stopped. It was at this time that carriage began to sway back and forth. Suddenly, a huge black dog with glowing red eyes burst forth from the back of the carriage, running as fast as it could go, followed closely behind by a huge swarm of black flies chasing after it, trying to land on its head. The funeral party watched as the dog flew past, on down the hill and across the river to the other side, with that swarm of flies hot on its heels, until it disappeared into the woods. They then noticed that the funeral carriage was able to move, so they started back down the hill to the cemetery. When they got to the graveyard, they also noticed that Joshua Phipps' casket was much lighter than it had been when it was loaded into the carriage back at Rotherwood Mansion. Nevertheless, they put the casket into the ground and buried whatever, if anything, was inside. It's said, though, that to this day, if the conditions are right, you can see a large black dog with glowing red eyes on the Rotherwood grounds, dashing across the hillside in utter terror, closely followed by a thick swarm of flies streaming after it. And folks, that's the story of cruel slave master Joshua Phipps of Rotherwood Mansion. Another one of the stories that make up the folklore of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for watching. Till next we meet. Sweet dreams, y'all.